All right. Today's meeting is being recorded, and we will share the recording with anyone who has registered. So we want to thank you very much for attending our inaugural author series called Lessons Learned. And we're very excited today to have John Gardner, founder and CEO of the Gardner Institute, with us, and talking about his book, launching the first year experience. You can't see it, it's too fuzzy, but anyway, excellent book. Very excited to hear John talk about it. And I'm going to start and pass it over to my colleague, Drew Koch, to get us going.
Katie, thank you. Colleagues, it's great to be here. I'm Drew Koch. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Gardner Institute. Been with the Institute for about 13 years now, right? And going on, just started my 14th year. And it's a pleasure to be with you. I got to be in my role in large part because in 1993, I was thinking about going to graduate school. A dean at my undergrad institution recommended I go to the University of South Carolina. If I went there, she recommended that I look up and interact with a professor by the name of John N. Gardner. And this isn't about my book or my story, but I will say that's where my story intersects with the person who is the focal point of this first in our ongoing series. The Gardner Institute is a 24-year-old, soon to be 24, starting its 25th year organization. 501c3. Our mission is broadly focused on improving teaching, learning, student success and completion in colleges and universities across the United States. And in doing so, advancing broader society equity and social justice goals. Now, that had been our implicit mission statement since our current guest and focus of the author series, John Gardner, co-founded the organization with Betsy Barefoot. It became our explicit mission statement with board approval in 2016. And over the years, we've worked with hundreds and hundreds of colleges and universities, drawing on John and Betsy's work and the work of others who have been worked here as well. We're doing this author series and kicking it off fittingly with one of our two co-founders, simply because it dawned on us one day as we have a lot of people affiliated with the Gardner Institute who have been writing books, writing essays, writing journal articles, doing national presentations, really excellent thought leaders in higher education. In our John's case, I was going to say current guest, but John, I think you're a heck of a lot more than just a guest, right? But in John's case, for 56 years in higher ed, right? And we said, well, why don't we? Katie and I one day said, and if you like it, it was Katie's idea. If you don't, it was mine. But why don't we start to basically interview our authors? And so that's why we're doing this now, right? It's definitely mission consistent, as you're going to hear soon as John talks about his work. I will say, when you work at the John N. Gardner Institute for Excellence in Undergraduate Education and you are starting an author series, there's no better book to start with than John N. Gardner's memoir, right? Launching the first year experience movement, right? The founder's journey. And so that's our focus today. So, John, it is wonderful to have you with us. My beloved professor for now, actually next month, we're going to start our fourth decade, right? We'll move into year 31. So still learning a lot from and with you, John. John, I'd like to kick this off. And by talking about your book, published by Stylus recently, and started at the beginning, start at the introduction, on the first 3 pages of that. You reflect very thoughtfully, because it's you, broadly on the trajectory of the student success movement over the past 50 plus years, and with it, efforts on higher ed equity, right? And you also reflect on where we are now as a nation doing this work. Now, I was thinking about you, and I was thinking about this book in particular. I'm a fan of Tom Wolfe's writing, and Tom Wolfe once wrote that everyone at least has one great book in them. And by that, he said their memoir. Now, in your case, John, you've had more than one great book in you, right? I mean, it goes back, I think, even before, but at least 1989, the freshman year experience, right? And there have been a few ever since. So, but here we are now, right? And there's this great book, your memoir. John, could you tell us why this book and why now, right? What compelled you to do it, and why were you compelled to do it now?
Yes, Drew, I certainly can do that, and I will. It sounds like a simple question. It is on some levels, but there are a lot of reasons why, and so I will give a more complex, I think, response. I don't know necessarily first note or priority, but I had an editor that I'd done a number of books with previously, David Brightman, who'd been with Josie Bass and then was stylist. And he urged me to do this. He kept pushing me to do this. And finally, he offered me a contract, actually not me, my employer, the Gardner Institute, a contract to do this. And then there's always the matter when you make a decision like this to do something, when do you really start? And like most writers, just sit down and do it. There are a lot of things have to come together. And from started this on Martin Luther King's the celebration of his birth date on was January 16th, 2021. And that was fitting for me because of the influence Martin Luther King had on my development as a young man. When I first heard him, and I talk about this in the book, when I first heard him, I was driving on the Garden State Parkway in New Jersey on the way to an absolutely meaningless job, but one that had a huge impact on me. My father wanted me to have a character building experience. So for 3 summers, I made beer cans, not a drop to drink, but in unbelievably hot, dirty, loud, dangerous work settings. And I was driving here to my shift, and I heard this voice on the radio, and I thought, who is this? What is this? And I pulled off the road, and of course, it was his famous, what became known as I Have a Dream speech. And that had a huge influence on me. And it encouraged me, I was in college, to think about, well, what is my dream? And so that was the day I started, but it was in a larger context. Drew and I are 2 leaders of a higher education organization that are very self-aware in terms of the immediate and long-term impact on our work of the historical epoch in which we live, and what are the broader societal factors influencing our work either positively or negatively. And in that case, this was in January of 2021. We had recently elected a new president, and we were very hopeful that 2021 would bring in the Biden era a return to a less divided country and a significant reduction, if not outright elimination, of these powerful forces at work to set what I'm fond of calling the unfinished civil rights movement back, and to stop this effort to advance the cause of social justice. So I wanted to be hopeful about that, but it became very apparent that the negative influences, from my point of view, of the Trump presidency were not going away. And that certainly was underlying my concern. And I also had become very aware, that the original leaders, intellectual leaders of the student success movement, and by that I mean the primary thinkers on what we've come to call student retention, and that language has shifted somewhat now, student success, overwhelmingly were white men. And a number of them were no longer living, and the others were pretty far advanced in age. And so I thought, well, I am one of those, and I better get some thoughts down while I still have the time and the ability. And previously, all my writing for publication for books about higher education have been done, all 7 of them. My first was in 1989. And before this, the most recent was in 2021. And during that period, I did 7 books, but always with others, always as part of a team effort, which is the way I like to work. I rarely ever do anything by myself. And but I decided that this time, what I wanted to do was to write a history of the so-called first-year experience movement, and to try to encourage others to join that movement, and to show people that it's really pretty simple if you do certain things. And one of the things that I wanted to relate was that I had what I call in the book a water bottle. No, not a water bottle. My editor, I used that metaphor initially, and David Brightman, my editor, he made me strike that. And I used another one instead, a roller bag moment. And that is when all of us, in this session today, we've seen things that needed to be addressed, fixed, challenged. And sometimes we do something about it, sometimes we don't, or we wait for others to do it. But once in a while, we see something or we think of something that nobody else has thought of and nobody else has done. And I had and I'll use a roller bag. Why didn't I think of putting wheels on suitcases? That's been a back saver for me for years now. I'm so grateful to whoever patented that originally. So I had a roller bag moment, and I wanted to write a book based on that. What is it that I saw that nobody else had done, but could have done, that really amounted to something once I got lots of other people involved? So that was another stimulus for me to do this. January 2021 was, the year we had been through the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, thank goodness. And it appeared like we were having a significant increase in interest in middle-class Americans in the unflinched civil rights movement. And we had the terrible murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and all this turmoil. And all of this was part of that context. And one of the things I was most concerned about in my own work was that we invite more people to join this movement who previously had not been part of the movement and who had lots they could bring to bear on this. But I was also concerned, Drew, that there was an increasing hostility that I was encountering personally amongst the higher education community by the simple virtue of the fact that I'm a white male. And I'm a privileged white male. And it just is an inescapable conclusion, unfortunately, if you interact with me. So I began increasingly asking, what is it that we privileged white males have to add to this work? Why should anybody listen to us if we hadn't ever been disadvantaged, and if we had never been discriminated against, et cetera? So that was another thing I wanted to do in this, to invite more people to join this movement, because we need everybody involved in this, not for those just for who's have directly experienced injustice. So I don't know, Drew, all of that came together, and I decided I would undertake this challenge that my editor had given me. And this is my first solo book. It won't be my last, I suspect. But I didn't start it out as a memoir. I started it out to write this history of the so-called first-year experience movement. But I realized as soon as I got into it that I couldn't do that without explaining why the undergraduate experience for all of us matters, and how it shapes us to become the kind of adults we're going to be in whatever we do and contribute to our society. So a third of this book is really about
your undergrad experience. And let me stop you there real quick, because I want to read something to you. Okay. Your words, so they should be pretty familiar, right? It may be a little weird hearing somebody else read your words to you, but about your undergrad experience, right? And I want you to then comment on just that, if I may. And that is, you write in a chapter titled "My Collegiate Journal," right? And you were talking about your senior year capstone experience. You said, my undergrad experience had given me perfect experiential preparation for dealing with homesickness, making a transition from home and differentiating from my family norms, becoming profoundly engaged in both their curriculum and co-curriculum, developing an adult life while sustaining a system of core values and relationships, building my character through intercollegiate athletics and co-curricular group membership, serving my country, pursuing the cause of the unfinished civil rights movement, figuring out my own unique way how I can pursue an adult life in search of justice. And you go on that same page in that same chapter to share in spite of your undergrad experience, or maybe because of it, you learned that you, quote unquote, attended a college where there were only 2 Black students I can remember over 4 years. Few students doing remunerative work on campus while being full-time students. No part-time and no commuting students, as far as I knew, I being you. No transfer students. No, in your words, jock majors and no athletic scholarships, and very few women faculty. Only 3 of my 40 undergrad courses were taught by women. So, John, you were going there, but then I figured I was going to use your words to keep us going there, right? So I did. But can you tell us more how that experience, in particular, in undergraduate education, how your undergraduate education experience served as the foundation for everything else you've done over the past 56 years, right? How did that, in profound ways, both influence you and also cause you to ask questions?
Okay, I guess I ought to start with what is most important. It really, this part of the book, a third of the book, is an argument for the power of undergraduate liberal arts education and how to preserve a democracy and to produce citizens. We need more people to experience that kind of education. So in my case, I think the most important thing that happened to me was the realization through the curriculum that I must build a life around a certain set of core beliefs and what I will call a philosophy of education. And it was in actually several courses that I took that I got what I now think of as the big ideas that I walked out of college with. And the biggest of those big ideas came to me in November of 1963 when I was taking a course in political philosophy, and specifically on the day that John Fitzgerald Kennedy was murdered on November 20th. And we were reading Plato's Republic. And we were at the point in the course where that afternoon, the professor was going to make sure that we all understood the importance of the fundamental question that Plato is, or Socrates rather, is pursuing in this work, is the question, what is justice? And that was an idea that I hadn't really in a shaped way come to college with. But boy, did I leave college with that as the question. And I knew that I had to find a way to devote my life to answering for myself and hopefully for others, some others, a response to what is justice. How could you achieve more justice for more people in this democracy? And I don't know that if I'd gone to any other college, I would have left with that insight. But that was the big one. And I had other intellectual experiences that shaped me profoundly. One would be, why do people in some parts of the world, why do they voluntarily choose totalitarianism? Why do they give up democracy? Why do they give up freedom? The best book I read on that was in college. I read it in 1961 when I was a first-year student. It was Eric Fromm's work, Escape from Freedom. That work, again, appeared on the Amazon bestseller list in the first Trump year, when apparently Americans were willing to give up a number of tenets of democracy and doing so voluntarily. And that, of course, was very frightening for someone like me. But it was in the college experience that I came to understand why do people give up their freedoms in return for certain trade-offs and the dangers of that. It was also in college intellectually that I discovered the power of as manifested in the transcendentalist writers in the 19th century, particularly Thoreau and Emerson. And those two essayists had a profound impact on my thinking. I could go on. So the main point was that this showed me how to have an intellectual foundation for whatever work I was going to do. And I didn't know what that work was going to be yet. But and also beyond that, as I later realized, that a lot of my undergraduate experience was about how not to design an undergraduate experience. I had a first year, which I wouldn't wish on anybody. I was a miserable failure in my first year of college. And
yeah, tell folks, you shared this publicly before, right? Remind those who may have heard it before and share with them, what were your grades that first term?
Well, my first semester, they were 3 Fs and 2 Ds. And the coach said, son, it looks to me like you spent too much time studying one subject, namely that he got the D in. And in my case, the 1A I got was in physical education, which was an automatic A because I was a varsity athlete. And if any of you ever visit me in my office, I have a picture of the crew team on which I was a member, and almost nobody that looks at that can find me in that picture. But it was a profound character development experience for me. And it was the only thing I can say, well, not, it was the primary thing that was successful for me in the first year. But beyond that, so as Drew is suggesting, I made terrible grades. I got an academic probation. I was very, very lonely, homesick. I was clinically depressed, experiencing a great loss of a former life. My college had no counseling services of any kind, no academic support services. I had my first advisor told me that, and I quote, "Mr. Gardner, you are the stupidest kid I've ever advised," which when I thought about it was probably extreme. I wasn't doing very well, but was I really the stupidest kid he ever advised? But he was persuaded I was. By the way, he eventually left my college and went on and became a college president in Texas. Great fit for Texas. I learned that in order to get ahead in college, I need to fire the first advisor and get an advisor who could develop a respect and with whom, one of Drew's and my favorite words in our work is, we're interested in developing relationships with the people we serve. And we serve a lot of people. And I developed a relationship with a man who was committed to doing that with me. And that was another thing that initially I didn't have in the first year, but I finally did. And in the first year, I learned that I couldn't get anywhere if I didn't get more engaged with my faculty. And I had a student who, thank God, we know from 50 years of research now that the greatest influence on college students is the influence of fellow students. And this sophomore student, by which the Greeks meant through the concept of being sophomoric, wise fool, this guy came up to me and he said, John, we were taking a course together in Introduction to American Government. And he said, John, I noticed you're not doing very well in here. Yes. And he said, I also noticed you're not taking any notes. And in my immature way, I said, so. And he explained to me, he showed me his notes and how he was able to predict exactly what the professor was going to ask on the exam based on his note-taking system. Well, it was like a fundamentalist looking at any page in the revealed word. And I began copying this guy's note system, and my grades began to go up, incredibly. But the point was that my college offered no systematic form of academic support. Now they do, thank goodness. Now they have counseling services. Now they spend a lot of time working on academic advising. But all of that was missing for me, Drew. And for the most part, I was not getting a lot of what I needed in the first year. And so as I got into my career, one of the points of resolution for me was to try to prevent other students from having the kind of first year that I had, where my college president at the orientation session announced very proudly in the tradition's old statement, look to the left, look to the right, and the two you just looked at won't be here. And he was grinning when he said it. He was obviously pleased by this. And I was in college when a mark of quality was, on an institutional perspective, was the number who didn't return, the number you got rid of, you filtered out. And, I look at the historic design of the beginning college experience, and up until now, it's always been about eliminating people. It's always been about preventing people from advancing. And it did a great job of that and almost prevented me from advancing. And the other basic purposes of the first year are to make money. And the first year has been very good at making money. What could be more American? And it's been designed to prevent the kind of people I eventually became, a full professor, from ever seeing first year students if I didn't want to. And I realized early in my work, somehow we've got to design a first year for other reasons than those, particularly the one of winnowing out people. But that's the era that I went to college in, and years later. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Say, early in our work in the Gardner Institute, we got the chance to design with our partners at the Higher Education Research Institute, UCLA, a survey that's still in use. It's called My First Year of College, your first college year. And one of the things I wanted to know was what proportion of entering college students terminate a romantic relationship in the first year. And I wanted to know that because I didn't do that. And that was not a smart thing on my part. It was not supportive of me. So I got an answer to that question. It was about 29%, as a matter of fact. Now there's some question as to whether, entering college students even want romantic relationships. But anyway, so my first year was very mixed, and drew a big impact to the undergraduate experience was to see if I could help other colleges not provide the same kind of first year experience.
On a Dewey notion, right? The experience is the best teacher.
Yes.
Yeah, there were aspects of your experience that taught you both about what helped you thrive and also what didn't. And
Right.
in that regard, knowing you for as long as I have, I know the tremendous impact that lived experience was on you and your work over the past 5+ decades. Now, you did succeed at Marietta, despite your initial advisor's predictions, and had a wonderful academic career there. You then went on to I don't think it was initially designed as a year of graduate school at Purdue, but the Air Force had different ideas for you, or actually the Army had a different idea, and then you volunteered for the Air Force, right? And so you finished your grad degree at Purdue, and then served your country during the Vietnam conflict for a number of years in the Air Force, where you were based in South Carolina. And I'm sharing this because, yes, it's in the book. It's also the topic of many an excellent lunch or dinner that I've been able to enjoy with John, right? I love delving into this, but I'm going to ask you to share some reflection that you had, particularly on your time in the Air Force. And then I'm going to follow up once you share that with a question or two, but giving you advance notice. It's about calling, it's about mission, right? And so I'd ask you to go to the top of page 77. Where the chapter in this section is My Life in the Air Force, and I Should Have Paid the Air Force, right, is how you titled that. But if you would go ahead and read that first paragraph there, and then I'm going to follow up with a request or two, right? So go for it.
Starting at the top of page 77, correct?
Yep.
All right. I should just say as context, I've got my draft notice the first year I was in graduate school. I passed with flying colors the one test I'd won flunk. So I was about to be inducted, and I decided to volunteer for Air Force officer training to increase my probability of surviving this whole business. And the Air Force, in its infinite wisdom, made me a psychiatric social worker and sent me for active duty at an Air Force hospital in Sumter, South Carolina, where the following would be applied. Okay, quote, it can be reasonably asked, and is being asked by some thoughtful educators, how can privileged white people, especially older white men, i.e. like me, possibly have the kinds of experiences and background that would provide them with sufficient understanding, empathy, compassion, let alone commitment to be effective in today's efforts to increase the equity levels of opportunities and outcomes for less advantaged college students? Of course, I can speak primarily to my own life experiences, such as my intellectual preparation in college and graduate school, my summer work as a steel worker, my active duty time in the Air Force, and my 5 years teaching in a federally funded anti-poverty educational program, which I'll write about later, namely my experience in TRIO, Upward Bound, and then my 32 years as a university professor for thousands of first-generation Pell-eligible students in South Carolina. I can also argue more broadly that to win requisite support for these deserving students, all of us have to be aboard. In my own case, I'm well persuaded that the sum total of my experiences prepared me as well as any man of privilege could ever be prepared to make significant contributions to the cause of advancing equity. And it's the Air Force that I assign much of this experiential credit. And then I say, thank you, U.S. Air Force. And folks, very simply, that was my first introduction to living, not in a democracy at all, it's an authoritarian system, but it was far more supportive of equity in the late 1960s, 1960s, than anything else I saw in South Carolina at that time. And
well, John, and I think I know from conversation with you is that experience in the Air Force linked what you'd learned of Marietta and what you'd reflected around Marietta about the question of what is justice with the idea of mission, right? And so having shared or read what you just read, how did that Air Force experience? How did you learn about even the concept of a mission?
Okay.
And then what was your mission going forward once you learned about it?
Well, this learning experience about mission made me realize that as a student in a 4-year residential liberal arts college for privileged people like me, and then in graduate school, by the time I was 22 in officer training, nobody had ever said to me that I had an obligation to perform service. Nobody. It was never said. And along with that, it was never suggested that I or anybody else needed a mission. So on the first day that I arrived at my permanent duty station after training in Texas, and I had a session with my squadron commander who introduced me to another kind of real world. And that other kind of real world was that I, as a privileged white man, would be working for a black man. My first boss in the Air Force was a black man. And he did not ask me to be comfortable. He braced me at attention, and he told me that he was going to give me an order to perform service. I didn't know what he meant, so all I could say was, "Yes, sir." And I said, "But sir, what do you mean by community service?" And he said, "Well, I mean whatever the Air Force says it is, Gardner. We own you." And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "In your case, it means doing university teaching. We are desperate for teachers, faculty, and you have more formal education than anybody in our squadron except the physicians. And so you're going to do some teaching." And I said, "But sir, I've never done this before." He said, "That's all right. The Air Force is telling you you'll do that. You'll start immediately." He had my credentials reviewed within 48 hours, and I was almost immediately approved to teach 6 different college courses by the nearby University of South Carolina. So it was in that context where he had told me that we were like an occupying army, occupying a foreign country, where we were going to bring the surrounding society into our vision of democratic views that suggest that all people should have equal opportunity, and that we were not going to practice racial segregation, and that we were going to promote people based on merit, not on skin color. And 2 weeks later, I started teaching my first college course in an open admissions, rural, non-residential, higher education environment where all my students were either children of mill workers or mill workers themselves. And where I was teaching the first semester, we admitted our first Black student to that campus, one student, and a young man with incredible courage. And I had the privilege of having him in my class. And on the first night of class, one of my white students, who was everybody but this guy, asked me what I thought of, quote, us having to have, and then he used the N-word, in this class. He actually said that to me. And I had some series of interactions with this young man, which led me to finally tell him I was an Air Force trained killer. And if he didn't get up and leave the class, I would throw him out. And we settled the matter of civility right then and there in that class. And that also settled my mission. I was hooked. I knew that these students were not responsible for the values they brought in, for how they treated each other, and for especially all that they hadn't learned, and that there was huge need for these students who had great curiosity. They were intelligent, and most of all, they were brave. They were attempting to do something that no one in their families had ever attempted to do before. And thank goodness for the University of South Carolina bringing this campus to an otherwise pretty lacking of any of the modern accoutrements of civilization. And they were also brave because they were undertaking something they had no family history. And they knew if they didn't succeed in this, they would be drafted and they'd be headed for Vietnam. The stakes were very high. And those students and that mission hooked me for life. And I knew that I'm not necessarily there by any means, that this was a frontier and that this was a kind of missionary work for which I could have great zeal. And yes, it's not as a savior, but to help these citizens of ours save themselves from a kind of life which they didn't have to lead unless they, or until they completed some form of post-secondary education. And that was the mission. It was to expand opportunity to people who had never had this kind of opportunity before. And so I realized what I could have learned in college, but I didn't. And I learned that great organizations are mission driven, and where everybody that's involved signs on to the mission. And the mission is bigger than any one person in the organization. And the mission guides everything you do. It provides the values base for, in this case, ultimately, for most of us who are mission driven, for life's work. Now, Drew, you did ask me what my mission was in the Air Force. My mission was to be the one psychiatric social worker accompanying the one psychiatrist at a base for 8,000 active duty troops and 19,000 dependents. And our job was to provide military mental health services for that population that was under enormous stress, because all the troops were headed for, they had a one-way, well, hopefully not a one-way ticket, but they were on the way to Vietnam, and or they were coming back from Vietnam, and they were profoundly different when they came back from Vietnam. And that had a huge experience on me, to be on that journey with them and to be trying to help them through what was an extraordinary transition. And that got me interested in how do people survive and hopefully ultimately thrive in transitions? How is the transition into the Air Force similar or dissimilar from that into college? And I feel in retrospect now, the Air Force was much better at guiding transitions and assimilating and socializing people into the new organization than most of us are in higher education. And I can put it in the words of my drill sergeant, who would ask us periodically if we wanted to survive Vietnam. And of course, we would recite or respond in unison, yes, sir. And then he would give us the answer. And the answer is very simple. There are three ways of doing things. There's the right way and the wrong way and the Air Force way. And if you want to survive Vietnam, you're going to unlearn the wrong ways, and you're going to unlearn some of the things you think are the right ways, and you're going to learn the Air Force way. And it wasn't until I, got a job at the University of South Carolina responsible for a first-year program that I learned that we were in that business to get students to differentiate the right way and the wrong way and the USC way. And my mission, again, was the same. It was helping people learn the USC way so they could be successful there, so they could fulfill a set of life objectives, and that we could teach people how to succeed. There's a body of knowledge and skills that can be taught and modeled and then emulated. And so mission has been at the center of all the work, and Drew and I have the privilege of working in a very mission-driven organization. And without that, we're nothing. We can't do anything really of significance to help anybody. So I wish I had discovered the concept of mission in college. I didn't, but college prepared me to be receptive to it when I learned it.
Now, one of the elements, and you alluded to this, but I'm going to ask you to touch on it a bit more deeply, and it just occurred to me. As a untenured young faculty member at the University of South Carolina, you got a phone call.
I did.
From President, Dr. Jones, Thomas Jones.
Who I never met. I didn't know he knew my name.
Never met before. But essence, what that president said is, Gardner, you're highly educated, you're highly privileged, and you're going to do service. Now, he didn't say it that way.
But that's what he was saying.
But he gave you an offer you couldn't refuse as a untenured, he offered you an opportunity to apply all those experiences, whether they were from Marietta, they were from the Air Force, but they were all mission related, to help co-design, and years later then become the director of now a national model, a national innovation around first-year student success, about helping students learn to, quote unquote, love the university, right?
Correct.
And to do it in ways, and that's a strong term, the term love, right? But that became your mission. Mm-hmm. So, John, you don't be modest about this, right? How do you know you were successful at that?
Well, folks, let me tell you this. The first offer that was made to me was an invitation. It really was a command performance. Gardner, I'd like you to take this job. But the man was desperate. It was 2 weeks before he was leaving the University of South Carolina as president to become executive vice president for research at MIT. He was a world-class thinker, researcher. And he told me that he had asked 2 other people before me, and that both of them had turned him down. And he said, so John, please accept this. And after I knew what he was asking me to do, I said, well, I need to talk to my dean. Deans are always more powerful than presidents over their faculty members' lives. And I had a spouse then, and she had some influence. So I thought, so I need to talk to her. But I was inherently a risk taker. And so I did accept the position. And Drew used the word love. That was the mission. This initiative, which was called University 101, it grew out of a student riot at the University of South Carolina, where the president was barricaded in his office for 24 hours. Students set the building on fire. And he resolved that he was going to get to the bottom of why the students were so angry. And that as a response to this, we were going to find a way to, in his words, teach students to love, L-O-V-E. That's an active verb. And his view was, if you could teach people to love something, they would thrive in it and they wouldn't want to leave it. And so we launched this spectacularly successful innovation. Drew asked me, how would I know? Well, something recently, I never thought this would be a metric of success, but the university year in, year out has been, I'm not really fond of this ranking system, but one of the things of the U.S. News and World Report annual rankings review is what's called the first year experience. And the University of South Carolina has been the nation leader at that. We're ranked #1. And a couple of years ago, they started putting that on billboards. And so there are billboards in the Southeast, inviting the viewer to get the #1 first year experience in the country at the University of South Carolina. So how do we know that? Well, I mean, you can see the billboard. One key is the kind of assessment that's been done on this initiative. And we were really a pioneer in the process of asking questions about what are your goals and how do you know whether you're achieving them, and to have a specific mandatory process for measuring whether or not you're achieving your learning objectives. So this has been going on for 50 years. So what we learned was that if you make a high enough level commitment to do something as an institution, and you really stay focused at it, and you get the design right, and you keep assessing it and learning from the assessment, and not flitting off to some new idea every 6 months or so, you stay focused. And this core focus was on making the beginning college experience a top priority of the whole institution, and having this initiative that everybody owns and everybody benefits from. And that was the model that we developed. And it was about teaching students to love the university. And now we have about 85% of the first year students that do this every year. It's not a requirement, but it's very popular. And we have students now who are 3rd and 4th generation in their families to have this experience. And each student is in a class of no more than 19 students. And each class is taught by someone. And this was part of the original president's model, that there was a specific training program to train faculty and staff in how to teach students to love the university. And that way we've had for about 25 years, actually more than that, pushing 30 years, a parallel model where each section of the course has an undergraduate or graduate student leader, a peer leader. And they are extraordinarily influential on helping students learn to love the university. Maybe that's enough on that, Drew, but that's how that got
John,
started.
it was love that ultimately led you to leave the university, and that was your love for Betsy Barefoot, right?
Yes.
And then I'm not going to trace the entire book. I will say that that love brought you to Western North Carolina, where, with the help of a program officer, the late Russell Edgerton from the Pew Charitable Trust, you promptly failed early retirement. And the Gardner Institute was born, right? And so we have been doing work around improving undergraduate education for about 24 years now. I mentioned that early at the onset. Love, again, being a strong term, but a valid term. There are many folks who you've met along the ways, whether it was 33 years at South Carolina or now 24 years at the Gardner Institute. And while I can ask you a whole bunch of more questions, we got a good 10 to 15 minutes left. And there are folks here who would love to ask you some questions. And as a matter of fact, they already have.
Okay.
Type some in the Q&A box. So I'm going to turn to Katie and ask her to share a few of those questions and pose them to John. So it's not just about what I want to ask you, but it's about what we, the audience, want to ask you. Katie?
Thanks, Drew. And thank you, John, for sharing your insights. And I would say to our guests today, please go ahead and pose your questions in the Q&A or the chat box. And I will do my best to ask John all of them. But we'll see how many we can get through.
Okay.
So John, oh, sorry.
Push me. Yeah, let's
Okay.
go.
All right, John. So this is the first question from Scott Reese. John, in this political climate, there are a number of folk in states where social justice aspects of your work are considered a problem. I imagine your life experience must have included moving through some of these similar times. Any advice on navigating this momentary blowback?
Yes, it's to, however you talk about your work, it's to find as many reasons for doing the work and possible outcomes of the work that everybody could agree to, that no one would find offensive. It's about using language that is not as dividing, and to point out that this work benefits everybody. Okay, and it is in the national interest. It is a patriotic duty to be doing this kind of work. All right. And, one of the more, I think, common ways of doing this now is to describe the work as to create more opportunities for successful employment. And it's related to the job market in the United States, to stress the practical outcomes of the college experience. And it's also when pushed to point out that when you look at the subpopulations in the United States, this is very ironic. There's one subpopulation of particularly white men who are objecting to this, and yet in the reality, there are more poor whites than any other population, any subpopulation we have. So that this is not about any one population. It's about using the higher education system as as part of the unfulfilled promise of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence to provide life, liberty, and happiness for all of our citizens, which is much more likely to be attained by college-educated people.
Thank you, John. Our next question, they asked it when you were talking about your time at Marietta, and they said, do you feel that the elimination of students was intentional? Were certain groups targeted?
I think we didn't have many, really. The subpopulations that existed in my undergraduate school were students who were members of Greek letter organizations versus those who weren't. The ones who weren't were known as the GDIs, the goddamn independents. Beyond that, everybody was white, middle, and upper middle class. So the desire to eliminate people was almost indiscriminate. We wanted to make as many people kowtow to the exceptional standards of the institution that could, and the mission was there to push on the finest into graduate schools. When I was in college, I'm amazed in retrospect now that we even offered a business major. It was very undersubscribed. And those of us who were at all serious about academics, we would never have majored in business. And the faculty openly had disdain for business students. Okay, so actually they were kind of a discriminated against population. They really were. There was prejudice against them. Whereas those of us who were preparing for traditional graduate school, law school, medical school, we were what the place was all about. So it was atypical, but typical of the times. So yes, the intent was to. It was an institutionalized Darwinian hazing process that you had to survive to get admitted to the club. And the only population, Katie, that I ever heard spoken respectfully about by the faculty, and this was 1961 to 65, were the veterans who came to the college on the GI Bill after World War II. That was only, 16 years before. And those students, what I heard about them, they were gods. They were mature, they were focused, conscientious, they did their work, they weren't there to drink and party, and they'd done all that they needed if they survived World War II. And the faculty wanted more of them, but they just had to wait a few years because Vietnam provided a lot of those same kinds of people coming to our campuses once the survivors from the military experience began to show up on our campuses, which they did. Next question.
Thank you for that. So this question comes from Daniel McNary.
Dan McInerney.
Dan McInerney. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Dan.
Sometimes I look at names and I'm like, oh, I'm not sure. So Dan, sorry about that. Thinking of the Institute's history in terms of change over time, what have been the major shifts you've seen in the strategies for student success?
I think the changes have been more they have been in the means we use to achieve the goals, but the goals are essentially the same. When we got our first grant from the Pew Charitable Trust, the charge that Betsy Barefoot and I got from our program officer, work not to duplicate anything we've done at the University of South Carolina, and most importantly, to engage in a set of activities that, quote, help institutions take more responsibility for student learning. Let me repeat that. Activities, strategies that help institutions take more responsibility for student learning. The opposite of us taking responsibility for student learning is to say that the students are solely responsible and to adopt a set of, or maintain a set of practices which in effect blame the victims. That argue that if you're not successful in college, it's your own damn fault. We laid everything out for you, and all you had to do was, take it in, eat it up. But of course, it's not that simple at all. And so what we're trying to do is to get colleges and universities to do things they have not done historically that don't compromise learning, and the opposite, enhance learning, but are accepting responsibility to do things for students that historically we didn't do. Like, for example, provide academic support, to teach students how to do academic work, to provide more support for mental health challenges, and to especially to provide what we now call faculty development, to realize that our faculty, by and large, are not prepared in graduate school to teach the kinds of students we have right now. By the way, that's an example of an answer to the question. The Gardner Institute is just now this week announcing for the first time that we're going to undertake a new initiative called the Graduate Student Experience, to look at how we and the work we're doing with undergraduates can ultimately embrace the kind of support that graduate students get, because those are the people that prepare the faculty and staff in undergraduate work, and they're the people who teach our baccalaureate degree recipients who know that they need even more to become successful in American society. So the work then was to engage in activities that got faculty and staff and student affairs officers and student success people working in more concept to thoughtfully redesign what we're doing in undergraduate education. Drew and I have a mantra that we use constantly, and that is that the way you're organized right now is perfectly designed to get the results you're getting right now. And if you like what you're getting right now, then you don't want to work with us, okay? Because we want you to get different results. And to do that, you have to focus on what you control, and you have to make certain adjustments. And so how we're doing that has changed. And initially, most of the work we were doing was focusing on the beginning college experience. Drew is leading a major new initiative now, which focuses on what we call transformation, which is integrating in a way that we never have before the first and second year beginning college experience. Another thing we're doing now is to spend a lot more time and energy as an organization working with faculty in pedagogy, how they're teaching college courses.
Yes. We're gonna try and get 2 more questions in, so I'm gonna cut you a little short there, if that's all right. So this question is from Jorge Montserrat, and he says, my institution has a course that all first students have to take that focuses on how to succeed in college. In my experience, I have to advise most freshmen the fundamentals of transferring from high school to college. What is your opinion about these courses?
Well, my opinion is they're very well established. They've existed in American higher education since 1882. We're going about them differently now, and that there's a very compelling body of research that suggests when like qualified students participate in these courses, they perform better in college than students who don't. There's also evidence that people who teach these courses receive significant benefit from what they learn from doing this kind of teaching and are ultimately more effective with their college students. This is about being more intentional with having students learn what are the behavioral choices and belief systems and patterns of interacting with college that are more likely to make you successful. We know what those are, and we can teach those, and we can require more students to do more of these things. So obviously, I've spent a huge part of my career on this topic, and Drew, as our no longer new CEO, is resolved to spend some more time in the near future here looking at these courses than we have been. We've had plenty of other choices, but another thing is we spend more time than we did the first 10 years helping colleges redesign these high failure rate courses. If I could do only one thing to improve the first year in American higher education, I would redesign and introduce new pedagogy into these gateway courses. This is where we're killing the students. We have to do better than this.
So, John, you're doing something
Yes.
right now that I'm going to ask you to do in
I know what
2 minutes to leave Katie a minute to do appropriate closure, right? One of the many things I love and enjoy about Fridays when I get to visit with you and Betsy, or any day that we, can eat lunch or dinner together, John, is that you come with a list of, elements, like things I got to tell Drew, right?
And I've been driving Katie nuts recently with a list of things I wanted her to do. Usually she's not subjected to this, so she knows what you're talking about.
And because you are consistent, right? There are a few surprises with it, John. The last chapter in this book includes 32 suggestions to readers, right? And you had one more suggestion that Baskins and Robbins has flavors ice cream, right? So you had a lot of suggestions there, right? So, John, I'm going to do what I could never do, right? So I'm going to ask you to do the impossible. Pick 3. Or at least pick, like, what are the ones that you want to make sure listeners today and readers of this book really take away from what you convey?
I mentioned folks to you earlier this afternoon that Drew and I are significantly influenced by historical context, and I'm reminded of the response of the French leader, Mr. Clemenceau, when our president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, introduced his 14 points. And Clemenceau was reported to have said, "Who is this guy, Woodrow Wilson, with his 14 points? Jesus Christ only had 10. And now I'm going to tell you, I got 32. All right. Drew made me comb, and this was terribly difficult. So, okay, of the 3 things that I talked about out of the list of 32, I think, all right, start with this. You got to have a personal philosophy of education that translates into the things you most want to do to promote student success. You have to know exactly what they are. Be very precise, very intentional. Down with serendipity, the hell with spontaneity. Okay, you got to have a plan. You got to do those things. So a personal philosophy of education and student success. Secondly, you need to have had somewhere in your life, in my case, it was in the military, and then thank goodness, in the university I worked in, that you have to have experience as part of a mission-driven organization. If you haven't been in a mission-driven, and that can even be just a relationship. Some families are mission-driven. But if you haven't been part of a mission-driven organization, you've been cheated. And I urge you to become part of one. So that was, in my case, that was hugely influential. And thirdly, of all the things I've done, the most important thing I did to help me understand my students so that I could be more effective with them was I taught them. I taught, even when I became a big-time administrator, I was a vice chancellor in South Carolina for 13 years. I never gave up teaching. I taught a course, at least one course a semester. So it's from, what did I learn from my students? And those have been more important than anything else I've learned along the way. Okay. Quick example. I met a man at a gubernatorial inauguration in 1998. I hadn't seen him for 24 years, as a matter of fact. He was in a tuxedo. I was in a tuxedo. And I looked at him and I said, good evening, Dr. Bell. No, good evening, excuse me, good evening, Mr. Bell. And he corrected me. He said, no, it's not Mr., it's Doctor. And he went on and reminded me that he had been a student of mine at age 16 in an upward bound summer enrichment program at the University of South Carolina. And he told me that I was the first person, I as a white man, he'd been in segregated schools. He said, I was the first person that ever let him know that he had any ideas of significance. And I was also the first person that ever asked him to write anything. Okay. That I was stunned. Okay. And these, I could give you many other examples of things I've learned from my students. So Drew, those are my top 3. I have 29 others. And I would invite anybody who wants a great sleep medicine, put a copy of this book on your nightstand, read a couple pages, you'll be right out every night, forget the medicine, and you can read the other 29. But what's most important is you write your own list, and you live in terms of your own list. And others.
Well, as I said earlier in this, paraphrasing the Tom Wolfe's element on everyone having at least one great book in them, their autobiography or their memoir. John, you have more than one great book, 7 to be precise, as well as many other things. But this is absolutely colleagues.
I'm going to do another one.
Yeah, well, good. At least 8.
Memoir,
but I highly encourage the launching the first year experience movement. John, you honor us by, and it's fitting, but you honor us. I mean, you could have said no. By being the inaugural author that we had on this series. And Katie, I'm going to turn it over to you to close things out and let folks know what's coming up next.
Thank you, Drew. So thank you, John. We really do appreciate, and you can tell us no, not that you often do, which we appreciate, but we do appreciate you being here today and sharing your insights with us.
I'd be happy to hear from anybody, Katie, who would want to correspond.
Excellent. We'll make sure people know that. And for those participants who are still here, we will be sending out the recording. And we do want you to save the date for the next one, which is on October 13th. And the authors we'll be talking to then are Aaron Brower and Ryan Specht Boardman, and they'll be talking about alternative types of education, things like credentialing, and their book, whose name I don't have in front of me, with apologies. But we will send out a recording of this, and we'll send you a little link to some information about that book. So we hope to see you on October 13th, and we do appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, folks. Thank you.